Welcome to the August CGO webinar. Our host tonight is CGO President Ted Courtney, and our main speaker is Derek Saghorn. I'm going to let Ted take over for now, and I'll be back to help with the Q&A, and Dan Sullivan will be watching the chat. So thank you very much.
It's a real pleasure to introduce Derek Saghorn tonight. He is the Vice President of Common Ground USA, the national organization. And he's also a very active member of the local California Common Ground chapter. Derek is an activist. He's a lawyer living in Oakland, and his focus is the interaction of urban development with transit and tax policy. He helped to create the Trans-Bay Coalition to advocate for the transformational changes to Bay Area transit with a regional lens. And in support of Proposition 13 reform, Derek has developed walking tours in the Bay Area cities to educate the public about split role initiative, schools and communities first. So Derek, thank you for being our speaker this evening.
Thank you, Ted. I appreciate CGO for allowing me to speak this evening. I'm just going to take a moment to share my screen. My fellow Common Ground California associate, Mark Molyneux, who I believe is here, helped prepare this slide deck. And like I said, my name is Derek Saghorn. I live in Oakland. I'm a member of Common Ground California, as well as Vice President for Common Ground USA. I'm also a member of a bunch of different organizations, but transit, tax policy, and housing, urban development is really my forte, as Ted mentioned. So I've been working for the last couple of years in terms of the Bay Area, which is one of the most dynamic kind of growing regions in the country, also has a really big problem with emissions in terms of mobility, of getting people from A to B to C to D in terms of their job, not just their job, but also going to the store, going to visit friends, going to visit family. And so a key element to reducing those emissions is going to be to get people out of cars, single occupancy vehicles, and onto trains and buses and bikes and other things that can really create the mode shift. And so we have, just in terms of, we need to get our housing and our jobs kind of sorted. And part of that solution is transportation, especially rail policy. And as it exists today, the Bay Area, where I live and I'm an activist, is contemplating $120 billion of rail investment to put a second subway underneath the San Francisco Bay, connecting Oakland and San Francisco, to unlock mobility just for people in terms of getting there, physically moving around, but also to unlock job access, to make it so people who live in Oakland can access good paying jobs in Silicon Valley and vice versa, educational opportunities at University of California in Berkeley or Stanford University or other educational opportunities. So the level of transportation investment that the Bay Area is looking at, the needs that we have are quite immense. And that's also true for Southern California in Los Angeles, the city and county of Los Angeles. San Diego is also contemplating a very large, about $100 billion rail transportation plan over the next 20 to 30 years. And Sacramento is investing in light rail and bus rapid transit. So throughout California's kind of urbanized regions, there's a high demand for transportation to address both these climate and kind of social mobility goals. But I think it's important to remember that when we add that transportation and that mobility and that value to our communities, that under our current paradigm, almost all of that value ends up in the pockets of landowners. And so that is not a theoretical, that is like has been demonstrated over and over again. Here's a chart from a study that shows the associated premium of land value to walking distance to various transportation types in different cities. And so this premium has been shown over and over again to exist, where the public, taxes itself or uses deficits to invest in this important social need of transportation. And then once they do invest in it, the value of that gets priced into home prices as well as rents. And that can drive unaffordability. That can oftentimes, because low income people who are dependent on transit or would be choice transit riders, get priced out of communities where this transit is put in. It means that we're paying for this infrastructure twice, right? Where we have to do our kind of affordability policies to mitigate the fact that the landowners are able to now charge more. And so we tax ourselves or our deficit spent for it once, and then we have to go and spend affordable housing dollars to prevent kind of or at least preserve affordability in these places going forward, which costs further tax dollars. So this is especially important. I don't want to just speak about California, but considering that at the federal level, between the bipartisan infrastructure package, which has passed the Senate and is now in the House of Representatives, as well as the Senate, is the budget reconciliation bill of, I think, last quoted at $3.5 trillion, is there's a potential for significant amounts of money that are coming down the pike for local communities to invest in transportation, especially in rail and BRT and other kind of systems. And as we start thinking about that level of investment, we have to remember, are we positioned to take advantage of that and to make sure that the public reclaims at least some of the value that's created through that public investment? And right now, in many communities, we do not have adequate tools to do that. And we can get into what the roadblocks are, but it's just important to understand that, like, now, given the potential influx of transportation dollars, we really need to move quickly to at least get these tools or set them up to capture some of this value. Because construction does take quite a bit of time, unfortunately, for some of these subways and BRT projects. So this idea that we capture some of the value, it's not necessarily new. It's been around for quite a while. Actually, the Bay Area, the neighborhood that I live in was actually built using a type of value capture, although it was privately appropriated, where it was a streetcar suburb, and the developer owned the streetcar line and the subdivisions, and was able to run the streetcar based off of the sales of homes. So that's probably not the best way to do it, but it clearly shows that transportation and housing link has driven growth in the past. In East Asia, especially in Singapore, Hong Kong, Japan, and South Korea, we see a lot of Taiwan as well. We see a lot of countries that are investing in this property plus rail model, where they may not necessarily use tax policy, which we might get a land value tax instrument or something similar, but they use land assembly near these transit stations acquired by the public to hold that land back, lease it for either market, i.e. rent maximizing, or social purposes, i.e. having affordable housing on site, or a mixture of both, in order to, one, get lease revenue back to help pay for the system, but also to generate ridership, because ultimately, in many cases, these systems are driven by fare. They can support themselves through fares, but if we don't have the type of transit supportive land uses, then we're not necessarily going to get to the place where these these rail systems can support themselves. So having a public-led development with land acquisition in at least in the East Asian kind of sphere models has been really great in terms of, one, capturing that revenue for the public, but also making sure that the transit is a long-term, that it's creating the land uses around the station that are long-term driving ridership, driving revenue, and creating the long-term success. So transportation doesn't necessarily become a huge ongoing public subsidy, it supports itself. So I think in California, at least, we're kind of hemmed in by a couple different things, and we have to be nimble and not necessarily rely on one particular solution. We have something called Proposition 13, which bans ad valorem taxes. So land value taxation in many respects is off the table. We have special assessment districts, but the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association, the group that started Prop 13, has created a number of other constitutional provisions, California state constitution, Prop 218 from 1995, or is it 1996, being chief among them, that makes it really difficult to set up a special assessment district to capture some of this value, even if we weren't necessarily going to have a pure land value tax or tax shift. So this is something, this special assessment is actually something that a lot of California cities used in prior years in the 20th century to fund development. In San Francisco, the Twin Peaks tunnel that runs from the Castro district to the Sunset was funded by special assessment, where landowners were charged an increment on top, and it very easily paid for this long tunnel that connected, that went through the mountains and opened up lots of subdivisions for development. There are 2 or 3 other tunnels that were funded similarly in San Francisco in the early 20th century. Los Angeles funded their Red Line subway in the 90s with a special assessment. But with this passage of Prop 218 in 1986, it really closed the door for the use of special assessments. So imagine if we could, California could, we might not be able to repeal Prop 13 anytime soon, but imagine if California could change the rules for special assessments to make them easier to set up. Because currently landowners are the only ones who can vote in the elections. It's predominantly biased towards landowners in terms of when they're noticed, how they can appeal, what the burden of proof for setting up, when an engineer would say, or an analyst would say, the value of this subway near your house is going to increase it by 30, 40%. The burden of proof is very high on the public sector to make that assessment. And so if we were able to make some small changes to that constitutional provision to make these assessment districts easier to set up, that is one key tool. And so what we're calling that is a land value district, capture district, where we would propose changes to the California state constitution as it relates to transportation within a certain geography of a transportation station, to say that we are allowed to very easily set up these value capture districts around transportation systems and at differential rates, right? If there's a new station, we can imagine charging a high recapture value for landowners for that new station. But in my mind, we shouldn't, if we're proposing to create a second crossing, to increase frequencies, to add longer trains, to have regional rail that runs between San Francisco and Sacramento, anybody who is near that system, one station within that system, given that level of investment, even if they're near a station that was built 50 or 60 years ago, is going to achieve land value gains, because the overall system is going to get a lot better, a lot more connected, and the opportunities, the mobility opportunities and amenities of that are going to increase as well. So not necessarily taking the idea that existing stations should not have some small percentage of their gain taken back as well. The second thing is what we're proposing is giving the subway operator in the Bay Area, BART, the authority to proactively go up and purchase land in order to make these type of property plus rail developments around stations. Currently, the rules in California, and oftentimes in the federal funding rules as well, prevent transit operators from purchasing any land that is not directly for their subway station, like developing the actual subway station or the right of way. They can, however, purchase land to build surface parking lots, which I think is bizarre if you're trying to increase transit ridership. But in my mind, allowing these operators, transit operators, to proactively purchase land around their station before speculators come in and bid up the price, so they can control both the height, the density, the intensity, reduce the parking minimums, because we know that allowing ample parking near transit stations actually reduces the ridership overall, so that public sector can make the choices that will increase, one, drive rents, appropriate the rents so the public sector gets them, but also increase ridership, add commercial office space, add retail space. Because if we just leave those decisions to the private market, the private landowners are, they're not necessarily taxed in California at anything near the actual market value, and they'll have very little incentive to play ball for any city that does want to do the right thing and create the transit supportive land use and development around these stations. So having the public sector lead this process, I think, is so important. One, just from a capturing value, but also to ensure that the transportation is actually well used and that we have the housing transit match that is so necessary. So that's what we're working on. I just want to pause and say, like, the next steps. That's what our dream is. But the next step is, like, how do we do this? And so, there are regional transportation advocates, including Mark Molina, who I mentioned before, Josh Hahn, who's also on this call, and a number of other people who may not even necessarily be, would you consider, Henry George acolytes, who recognize that this is important, and that they're going to BART board meetings, they're going to the regional rail meetings, they're asking their elected representatives both at the city and at the transit level, the regional level, to prioritize value capture as a strategy for this Link 21 project. And so that is the political action that we're doing. And so we are, in addition to that, we are speaking, we're presenting this deck essentially to other organizations, housing groups, affordable housing groups, transportation nonprofits, et cetera, and asking them do they share this vision of making sure that if we're going to put this much investment into infrastructure, that we are the public is getting something out of it. And that process has been actually really important for us, because we think that the proposal that we have has actually gotten better because of it. We heard from Transform, which is a transit social justice nonprofit based in Oakland, and they said that they'd really like to make it so maybe not all the money, that if we created these land value capture districts, maybe some portion of the money would go back, of the rents would go back to, or the captured rents would go back to the transit operator, but maybe 20 to 30% of those rents or that revenue stays in the community, and the community can make decisions about whether they want to prioritize affordable housing, anti-displacement strategies like purchasing dilapidated apartments and rehabbing them, building protected bike lanes, bus lanes, bike share, whatever the community making a decision about how they're going to plan their station for their when that train comes to town. And so I thought that was a really great point that we hadn't considered, and I think our proposal is stronger because we've reached out to other organizations and asked for their feedback to say, is this something you're interested in, and how can we make it better? And so I think through that process of organizing and talking to people and doing outreach, we are not only building a better coalition, but we're creating a better policy that hopefully, as Link 21 starts to develop more and BART starts to get more serious about the planning for this, those type of ideas start to get baked into the discussion, we're to the point where, of course, we're going to capture value when we build these things. And I'll say that we've been successful so far as the BART, which is the subway operator in the Bay Area. The board of directors, multiple members of the board of directors have now said that they support a value capture strategy. Details pending, but they even said they've expressed regret because when the original BART tube between Oakland and San Francisco was built in the late 1960s, early 70s, value capture was actually on the table. They Common Ground members from back then helped lobby to get enabling legislation for a very similar land value capture taxation districts around BART stations to pay for these improvements. And unfortunately, the politics of that time opted for a sales tax instead. And so one of the BART board members, Rebecca Saltzman, who represents Berkeley and Oakland, publicly has said at multiple board meetings that that was one of the biggest mistakes that BART has ever made, was that they didn't capture the value for that first Transbay tube, and that it would be, we must do so for the next one. And so I think that's really important to see our elected officials are understanding the history, understanding the lost opportunities, and are committing themselves to rectifying that going forward. But it's going to be a really big push to get something, to get the consensus, to get a constitutional amendment on the ballot, because that is what we would require. It's going to take a lot of organizing and a lot of coalition building. But we think it's really necessary, given the level of investment that we're looking at over the next 20 to 30 years. It's going to be absolutely necessary that we do so. So with that, I'll just pause and take a breath and see if there are any initial comments or questions.
Okay, we have one. I believe we have one question. Okay, please address value and cost of light rail versus full-size commuter rail. That's from Breck.
So I'm not familiar with the offhand, the differences. It really depends on the geography. Are you building? Are you running on the surface level? Are you tunneling? But it also depends on what the demand is necessarily like commuter or regional rail. If you're using existing right of way, it could be pretty cheap if you wanted to. So right now the proposal is to do both a subway, a traditional subway between Oakland and San Francisco, as well as a commuter / regional rail train, and they would both share the same tunnel. And so that would be very expensive. And so we want to say, like, we want to present ourselves as solving problems by saying these land value capture tools can help you pay for that.
To jump in here, I guess we've all been made panelists. Can I add to that for a moment?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's news just in the last day or two talking about some of the proposed ways they're expanding transit as part of the 2050 scheme. So this is down the road by 3 decades. And they're saying they want to run light rail down Geary Avenue in San Francisco. And people for years have been saying that's the #1, high capacity transit line they want to see in San Francisco. It would be a huge deal. And people have been saying for years it should be heavy rail because you need more throughput. And it's really telling for even 30 years in the future, they're proposing light rail. And I think a big difference here is I think people are hesitant to talk about big capital expenditures because they see it as an expense. You pay it, it goes to landowners, and you don't get it back. And I think a lot of different schemes you see back in my hometown of Cincinnati, they built their, street traffic light rail because it was a pretty cheap startup cost capitalization wise. Whereas I just think without the land value capture, we don't have the will to do heavier capital intensity. And I think if this changed, I think we would see more heavy rail. That'd be my instinct.
Anybody else? I think we got a couple people who are going to be asking. I know that Bill Nell of Washington, Oregon, Conroe has a question, and I think he just put it in. Hold on here. No, this is from Wayne Looney. I noticed that the apartments that are being constructed on part of the parking lot of the Bart MacArthur station. Is this planned for other stations? Was Wayne?
Yeah, yeah. It's actually, I think that's one of the most exciting things is that BART, the subway operator, has a very aggressive plan to take their publicly owned parking lots, ground lease them to market and nonprofit developers with I think a base affordability requirement of 35% low income and more oftentimes in order to generate lease revenue for the system. So they are planning over the next 10 years to build something like 10 to 15,000 units on their parking lots throughout the system. And so they see the property plus rail model of Hong Kong and Singapore as really important to as a revenue stream, but also to drive revenue and bring in fares. So that is Mark Molyneux and myself, we've spoken to the head of their TOD their transit oriented development program, and so they're working assiduously to try to develop many of these lots. An important thing that they did, though, is that they recognize that oftentimes you have recalcitrant jurisdictions that where there is a BART station, there is a parking lot, but they don't want to change the zoning to make these public investments happen or these public development of housing happen. So we actually got a bill passed a couple of years ago, to 2018, that set base density and height standards around these subway stations to say, if you're an affluent suburb like Orinda or Lafayette, and you have a BART station and a parking lot that owns by the operator, then you have to build a 5-story apartment building. You have to allow that. And so they've been able to advance a lot of their work because they've preempted some of the traditional affluent or not in my backyard type of jurisdictions.
And to jump in some more, yeah, I think we're seeing right now, BART has a bunch of assets, these old parking lots that some are being renovated, and it is a struggle in some places to actually get the density it should have in places like North Berkeley. But I think if you look at the rail and the rail land development model, you not only, I think, benefit from just having the transit on equal footing, but the places you see it work the best, such as Hong Kong, it actually is, there's a land subsidy built into the planning system where you actually not only allow the transit agency to build, but you actually give them kind of easier permitting, more capacity, and that extra, it basically is like giving extra land value right out of the gate to them. And that's a way of kind of supercharging what you can do with it, because it uses your planning potential to kind of really just print money from the get-go, as opposed to the long-term parking lots. They had to sit on that for decades before they really made money on that.
Let me see if I have any more questions. I don't see any in here. Right now, I don't see anything. So if you have more comments or if you want to continue on, I'll take it.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I'll just say, like, similar to what Mark just mentioned, is the important thing is if you're a transit operator that wants to kind of do something similar, we need to convince our transit operators that it's not just enough to develop your existing parking lots, your existing land, but to be in the business of acquiring land. Too often we have public entities, I think, have been in a austerity mode where they simply, we don't have the cash to acquire this land. And we need to kind of fundamentally shift that thinking. I think for more disinvested communities where the land prices are not as high, I think it's still tough because there are a lot of competing needs, but a couple of well-placed investments in land acquisition and key locations in downtown near transit, I think can help really, if you have the program that says we want to maximize these revenues, to develop our assets, our downtowns, our transit stations, you can help spur that growth that's so important. In kind of high cost, high land value systems, it's really difficult, but you need to start somewhere. Reading about the development of planning in Germany and England pre-World War I, there's a big movement in these communities to purchase land. And this is where there's just like very high land values in the inner city. And they understood that like a proactive land acquisition program was an investment in the community long term, because you were able to prevent speculation. You're able to plan the communities in the way that the public wants, and not necessarily just do sprawl or kind of not very thoughtful high density housing, but to really get it right. And you can only do that if it's public led, and you can only capture that value if it's really truly capture the value if it's publicly led and publicly owned. So that I think is so important, is convincing electeds and policymakers that, put a line item in your budget to buy land every year. Right now, it's treated as a one-off, and it's something comes across. And if you don't see anything that's worthwhile in that year, just roll it over to the next year. But currently, for example, in my city of Oakland, they make it so difficult to purchase land. It actually requires, if you want to, the average price of a single family home in Oakland is about $700,000, something like that. And they have it on the books in the city charter that the city council itself has to approve any land purchase or real property acquisition over $125,000. So you couldn't even purchase a single family home without the city council having to write it off and it being a whole big thing. So in my mind, we need to bump that threshold up, and then we need to set money aside and just empower the administration to, maybe there's a corner lot with a dilapidated house that could be, redeveloped into something really great. Empower the city administration to just go out and go get that. And I'm not talking about eminent domain or anything, but to go get it on the market when those opportunities arise. Because ultimately, that's the type of, we need a programmatic land acquisition near these transit stations, near these public assets. It can't just be one-offs, because you're never going to, landowners are just going to sit on and just reject any bid. You need to be active in that land market.
I have a comment from Adam Kerman of Chicago. Adam is secretary of the Henry George School of Chicago, but he's also a member and activist of a group long-term called Transit Riders Authority that deals a lot with Georgia's issues and transit. Adam's comment, he says, please don't limit the value capture district to just a quarter or a half a mile or so around the rail platforms. Inner city, that's done well, would be a significant area. Feeder and shuttle bus service extends the benefit of rail to a much larger area, and feeder shuttle services would be a part of the rail line's budget. If there is a feeder / shuttle that extend the capture district automatically.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely would support a bigger geography, and I think we started with a mile. We're probably going to get negotiated down. In California, we have a lot of kind of transit land use bills, and I'd say half mile tends to be the not universally, but there's consensus that is the watershed for transit stations in California. So that's kind of probably subject to negotiation, but it's certainly something to take. I think it's very easy to see that land values increase, and the watershed is much more than a half mile. But it's balancing that versus politics and how much you want a whole or a half loaf kind of thing, or no loaf.
I have another question for you.
Sure.
From Tom Gearing in Portland, Oregon. Have you looked at London's Crossrail project to promote an example of value capture that could be similar to the Transbay tube?
Yeah, actually, I'm glad you, Tom. Glad you brought that up. Crossrail had, I think, a very interesting way of funding. So they did a value capture where they had to purchase land parcels near their stations to go down and dig the tunnels for their subway. So they sold off afterwards. They sold or leased off that land to generate revenue for the project. And I think the line item that was like 5%. It was very small in terms of that type of land value capture. But they did something that I think is very similar to what we had in California last year, which failed, unfortunately, which was Prop 15. So Prop 15 essentially said that commercial landowners were going to be assessed at a market rate. Unfortunately, they've been assessed at their acquisition date, the year they purchased, 1985, 1978. So Chevron, which makes billions and billions, hundreds of billions of dollars every year, is being assessed on their property in Richmond and San Ramon in California at 1978 rates. And so this was going to reset that to market, which would have been great. We lost by 2%. So we're gonna come back at them in 2024, I think. But in Crossrail in London, what they did is it was assessment on the rates that people pay either for property, owning commercial property, or leasing commercial property. So if you're a large company with a large floor plate in central London, you're a financial firm, you had an assessment on your lease. And so that's probably a little not the best in terms of Georgia's purism, but the idea was that you had a type of property interest within that, some type of tenure, and that was actually the biggest funder. And so if you can conceptualize something like a commercial property tax assessment for large tech companies in the Bay Area, Facebook, Google, Apple, where they, large companies with big footprints, they had to pay a special assessment to help pay for these transformative investments. That would be something that I think would be really great. And unfortunately, you need to have the business community, like they successfully sold the business community on the value of that, and they got them to go along. It wasn't like they were able to beat them politically. They convinced the commercial property owners and leaseholders that this Crossrail, this big increase in rail capacity, was going to benefit them, and they decided that it's worth paying for this. So I think that kind of goes into a further question, is that we need to demonstrate to the business community, the public, that we're going to deliver these transportation projects. They're going to be good projects. They're going to be useful. They're going to be cost effective. They're not going to be super over budget, and they're going to be delivered in a timely manner. And I don't think, unfortunately, in many cases, our transportation projects have not done that so far. And so if we're going to go down a route like that, I think it will be incumbent on our public sector to get better at delivering these rail projects. So we don't have like the Central Subway in San Francisco, which is 3 years behind schedule and $100 million over budget or something like that. So these are the type of, we need to get better at a lot of different things to create the trust, both in the public, but also the business community that might pay this, that this is worth doing. Because ultimately, when we talk about San Francisco in the 1910s, when they did the Twin Peaks tunnel, they convinced the business community, thought that they could do it, and it was worth it. The landowners who were speculating on the far side thought that it was ultimately going to be worth it, and they would do it on time. And until we can demonstrate that competence, it is going to be difficult to get the buy-in, unless we have somehow just are able to get a lot of people suddenly become doctrinal Georgists in the next couple of years.
This is David Geeson, who sort of goes right along with what you're talking. He says, Derek, how do we buck the sensitive pocket nerve that is, as much as anything, the anus of resistance to the topic of all you're saying? Isn't logic trumped by emotion in the history of the world?
I don't know. I think in the California context, I think at least the support for the kind of feudal relations that we have with Prop 13 is starting to sag quite a bit. I don't necessarily know if people are making the connection between landowners benefiting from the housing shortage or the job growth or the transit investment, but the undergirding, the kind of ideological undergirding that you're talking about, I think is starting to get pretty weak. And so the question is how quickly can we scale up and to create a kind of a public facing case for these ideas and take advantage of that moment? Because 20 years ago, the kind of ideas that Prop 13, that we should pay for all these trains with a sales tax, that has been the status quo mindset for 30 years. And that mindset is starting to kind of erode. And so I think we need to take advantage of this moment and do a very good job of building up the Georgia's argument for these ideas, growing kind of the membership, and then building coalitions, with groups that are not necessarily pure Georgists on these questions.
Actually, to jump in on that, also, yeah, I think talking that kind of goes into the politics of it as well. And I think, Prop 13 has an emotional sway. We backed into it. And what are the emotions? The emotions are the emotions of home ownership, having a place, having kind of what normal people live in normal places, the poor widow kind of mindset. And that's very powerful. And I think part of the reason that a very narrow clawback for transit value capture districts works is not that many people live in a half-mile walk shed of a transit station. And more than that, they certainly don't own property unless you're a really, really rich person. So I think if you can claw back kind of, does this affect me? And you see that also with like the upzoning bills. If it affects every neighborhood, people start to get a little iffy. It doesn't feel normal. But the very narrow BART bills, it kind of sailed through because it's just kind of dividing your opponent in a certain way. So in a way that it's kind of friendly to like the agencies, it's friendly to a lot of interests, and it serves the public good without kind of getting to the large base of homeowners. I think that gives it it's a good foot in the door, I would say.
Don't see anything more. Dirk, you want to continue on or want more questions?
Yeah, I just continue to say, like, these questions for people who are in California, our ultimate goal is to get some legislation to enable these tools to really be widely used. We don't think that this is necessarily just something that people in San Francisco and Oakland can benefit from, but also people in Los Angeles and San Diego and Sacramento and Fresno. We've got high-speed rail that is being built there, and I expect them to continue to do their transit investments as well. So the point being that these tools can also be used. I think it's a strategy, not necessarily in any individual tool, but having a land value capture strategy for transportation investment should be integral for regional planning, for large transit operators that want to do this type of thing. It's also, maybe in your region, your particular rail agency isn't well suited to do this. BART it works across many different jurisdictions. It has held this property for a while. It had a couple trial projects that have been in the works since 1995. So they're well suited to it, but we don't need to force it, right? We could say we can envision another public agency in Chicago, for example, or Portland, that is tasked with developing to acquiring these properties near transit, developing them, and developing the ridership. Likewise, the idea of kind of the special assessments in the land value capture districts. I understand Oregon is also pursuing land value capture district or land value tax district legislation. Same thing with Minnesota. But my point is simply that connecting the idea, the needs of transportation, to this tool can be very helpful, especially given the goals of the Biden administration in terms of increasing transit ridership, investing in Amtrak, investing in light rail and subway and whatnot. And this, I think, is a good organizing opportunity for people across the country that might be expecting this type of investment in their communities in the near and medium term future. So yeah, I mean, that's what I would end with, and just say that to the extent that people are interested in working on this in the California context, or want somebody to bounce ideas off, I'm available and I'm happy to help out. But I do think it's important to branch out and create those coalitions with the housing organizations, with the transportation organizations, and show them that you have a tool or a strategy that can help advance both of their goals, or their myriad goals, while kind of spreading the gospel, so to speak, of the importance of kind of the public recapture of this value.
Let's see if we have any more questions. We have one. Hang on here just a minute. Hang on. This one is another one from Dave Geeson. How do the YIMBY folks respond to you, Derek? Not their words, but their deeds.
Pretty good. I would say most of them are very supportive. I'd say we've been actually, part of it is that they've been, because we frame these in terms of oftentimes value capture in the housing or YIMBY context is used to describe as something like inclusionary zoning. The idea of a set aside for low or moderate income housing in a market rate development. And I think there's a role for inclusionary zoning or something like that in planning discussions. Something that advances kind of fair housing goals in terms of desegregation and having mixed income communities. I think there's a lot of value in that. But unfortunately, in a lot of the kind of land use and upzoning debates, the inclusionary zoning or the value capture for upzoning, it almost becomes bad faith to the extent that people want to over capture or capture 100% of all value created, and in ways that would necessarily mean that no housing is created and no affordable housing is created whatsoever. So when I talk to YIMBY folks and I say I have value capture that doesn't just tax development but taxes landowners, or that leads to public development of land for housing, they're very interested because they're so used to being hit over the head with value capture as a tool to tax new housing development rather than one that is used to make sure that it actually gets developed.
I have another question for you from Adam Kerman. Have you seen any of the studies that show a benefit to land from local bus service that's not a point-to-point service like Silicon Valley shuttles, ordinary bus services that's not BRT?
I haven't. I would be curious, just because I haven't seen any studies along those lines. It'd be kind of difficult because oftentimes so much of our funding is tied up into BRT type projects, and so those I think would be pretty easy to measure. But if your local trunk line was running at 15-minute frequencies and then got down to 5-minute frequencies, I think that's a good question whether we can isolate those types of rental impacts. But no, I haven't seen it. It would be good to also get away from the idea that the only projects worth value capture are simply BRT or light rail or subway. Like all public investment, we should treat operational increases like that of increasing frequencies or just investing in a corridor. We would expect them to have some type of rental value. But oftentimes improvements in bus service is, one, there's not a lot of money for operations, and two, when it does get improved, it's often pretty marginal because just the way a lot of kind of regional governments and transit operators treat bus riders as a marginal group generally.
Mark has his hand up. He'd like to talk.
Yeah, I was just looking up. Dr. Shashir Mathur has, I think, isolated a lot of good geographic examples of transit stations. I think the econometrics. He hasn't really looked at buses. I think the econometrics is just much harder. It's very hard to isolate if you have like wide coverage of buses. I think theoretically you should expect to see a large increase based on bus service, but I think it's a challenge to actually isolate in the data, and I think it's worth attempting. I'd be curious to see any examples of natural experiments to look at, but it's an excellent question.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think we're unfortunately right now, just because of COVID, we're not necessarily in a good position to, even if somebody was going to increase their frequency by quite a bit for a trunk line, we're not necessarily in a good position to measure that just because of where we're at in terms of ridership.
Dave Geeson has another question. How do the Bernie Kratz and or KPFA crew respond to these ideas?
I don't know. I haven't pitched the Bernie Kratz per se. I think there's probably some level of support for this in the Democratic Socialists of America, some of those chapters. KPFA, that's a different issue. I think KPFA has a fair number of incumbent homeowners who live near transportation stations who might be adversely affected by this. So that might be a tougher nut to crack.
I'm going to ask a dumb question. What does KPFA stand for?
I don't know. Mark, you're the radio person, but it's a Pacifica radio, pacifist radio station based in Berkeley.
Okay. That's what I was after.
They're great though. They have great music.
All right. Okay.
Dan I wanted to note that the reason it's hard to assess value capture with buses is that they usually use price of the property rather than the rents. Mm-hmm. And the price of the property is a projected rent into the future. When you put rail lines in, you've made a permanent commitment. And so the potential buyer knows that rail line will be there for the next 20 or 30 years. When you bring in bus service, it can drive up the rents for now, but the property owner doesn't pay extra for the price because he doesn't see that rent as being permanent. That the bus service could disappear at any time.
Yeah, I think in the long term, I think if you build a solid bus service base, that is essentially permanent if you really prove you have the commitment. But certainly you don't get the same amount of like speculative frenzy over the announcement of a new transit station, which that's capitalized way up front. BART can say they're going to build here, and then suddenly it can triple in value before you can really blink.
I mean, yeah, BART. We talked to a BART POD staffer who told us an infill station down in Fremont that they haven't even approved or announced this, or they haven't approved the station yet, but they estimate that there have been speculators in the area since 2010. So we're probably still 5-6 years away from this station being built, and there's been 15 years of prior speculation on the site.
See if there's anybody else. Any questions? I'm not seeing anything. I'm not seeing anything in Q&A. Anything more, or then I'll turn it back to Ted.
Oh, that's about it. Yeah, but I'm just looking forward to working with folks on this and trying to take advantage of the opportunity of the next couple of years in California, and that we can try to get back up to Sacramento and get some legislation moving on this topic.
I think that's it. I'm going to turn this back over to Ted.
Well, thank you very much, Derek, for I think what was a very excellent discussion of what's been happening in the northern part of California and the work that you've been working on. And I think with the California Common Ground organization, we're really excited to see the new members that have put so much effort into transit exploration and are working towards achieving our goals. I put up a list of our sponsors. We've had over 20 people that have contributed the $99 to sponsor these sessions. And so we'd like to acknowledge them at each of the meetings. And several of the organizations have also joined. With that, I think that we're going to close the session. I thank you all for participating. We had a good audience this evening, and thank you all for attending. We do have our next session coming up, and it's going to be with the fellow from Germany who has been working on setting up a state land value tax in the jurisdiction that he lives. And I think that'll be kind of interesting to hear about. We've heard a little bit about it in the past, but it will be fun to ask him questions. And what is the date of that meeting, Sue?
That is September 30th. We're going to do that with Dirk Lauer, and our moderator will be Nick Tiedemann and the like. Some of you may know that we were going to try to have Charles Avila of the Philippines come and talk, but he has been ill and he has requested that we reschedule him. That'll probably be November. October, we're going to have James Galbraith in with Polly Cleveland as the moderator. And we are still in the works of trying to get Mr. Stolar we're going to, so we're in getting some rather high-powered speakers, but this I found very interesting, having lived next to or close within 2 blocks of a heavy and light rail situation in Chicago, and the values that I saw go up in those 40 years. So I really like this session. And with one little thing, we need to have a moment of sort of silence for the Ryback family. Erica Ryback died yesterday. She was the widow of Walt Ryback. So we thank them very much. And thanks for their support of our organization.
Okay, thinking of the Rybacks.
Yeah.
Thank you all for attending. And a week from tonight, we're having a brainstorming session of members of Common Ground that like to get together to talk about our future. And we're looking in particular about having a conference next year. And I think that'll be the primary discussion we're going to be looking at a week from tonight. So Common Ground members or affiliates are invited to attend that meeting.
Yeah, CGO members and affiliates and at-large people. We'll put out the notice either tonight or tomorrow morning.
All right, thank you all for attending and have a very good evening.
Bye for now, gang.
Thank you.